I'd like to start today's show with two poems. The first will be Rule of the Range by S. Omer Barker, followed by Cowboy, Count Your Blessings by my old friend Larry McCorder. For them old tie-fast cowboys, here is a rule that fits. Whatever you get your rope on, it's yours, or else you're its. Two waddies rode together o'er the western half so great, a buckaroo from Utah and a hand from the Lone Star State. Although they were raised different, of friends they were the best, so of each other's tack and ways they often could make jest. Hot debates were often floored of grazing bits or spades, center fire or double rig, leather straps or braids. Each piece stands the test of time, each serves a certain need. Each is worth its weight in gold, they finally both agreed. The sticky part, as you might guess, in talk of right and wrong, was whether you should dally up or if you should tie on. Said Utah, crazy fools like you should be kept up in a cage. Take your wraps and you, my friend, may see a ripe old age. It's easy on the cattle, it's easy on the horse, and so it stands to reason to be easy on you, of course. Texas says, now, buckaroo, that little spiel was nice, but it don't do cow or horse no good if you have to catch 'em twice. I saved your twine a dozen times, all 60 feet of it. You wasn't criticizing then, to that you must admit. The far west has big ranges, and they mount big crews, but then, to work one single baby calf takes twice as many men. You've saved my string, says Utah, I must confess it's true, but I'd rather lose 100 ropes than go what you went through. That time old Peaches blowed the cork and wrapped you in the middle, me and my old Shrade Walden got your smart self off the griddle. Cowboy, count your blessings that you didn't buy the farm, and all you got out of that little wreck was that white cast on your arm. Texas grinned. When you cut a man's line, cut it off up at the noose. Instead of one long, I've got two shorts, and neither is much use. And though it's broke, my arm's still here. In 6 weeks, it will mend. I've still got all my God-give parts, and you can't say that, friend. The first time that we ever met and I shook hands with you, I noticed that your right forepaw was short a toe or two. You speak of counting blessings, and I think that's just fine. So I'll keep my horn knot in my rope, 'cause I can still count all of mine. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Bunk Skelton. Bunk Skelton is a cowboy, a musician, and a pastor. He has cowboyed on ranches all over the panhandle of Texas, along with pastoring cowboy churches and playing gospel music. He comes from a family of well-known Texas cowboys, including his father, Fat Skelton, and his brother, Punch Skelton. I sat down with Bunk during the Western Cowpunchers reunion in Amarillo, Texas, and recorded this interview. Here's Bunk Skelton.
Well, I'm Bunk Skelton. I was raised up in Channing, Texas, North Amarillo. Kind of grew up on the area ranches around there. I lived in Channing, but small town, it's still in the country. But I grew up on the ranches around Channing and graduated and started working on different ranches. And right now I'm wound up down in Clarendon. And I still do a little day work. And I pastor a cowboy church there, and we've been there in the church since 2013 is when we started it. and it's doing okay. And but I just don't want to give it up, cowboying. It's seen it too many times where these old punchers go to town and hang up their saddles, and they don't last very long. And I'm not into that. I'm going to do it as long as I can. I grew up in town, and Dad had cowboyed all his life. At the time that I was come along, well, Dad was drafted right at the end of World War II into the Army. He was working at Reynolds Cattle Company then, Dalhart. And when he got his draft notice, well, he went and took his physical, and they told him, said, well, we'll call you. So he moved. Mom, and at that time he had my oldest sister Laura, and then my brother Punch, and my sister Carrie. He moved them to Hartley, and he worked for his daddy-in-law, who had a trucking company, just waiting on to be called into the service. And then they wound up signing the armistice, and so they never called him. And so he worked for his father-in-law for a while, and then he winds up working for the county. That was the first job I remember Dad having when I came along. I was born in Dumas, and they lived in Channing by that time. He worked for the county till I was about 11, and well, maybe a little earlier than that. He quit the county and started building saddles and had a boot and shoe repair shop there in Channing. So I spent a lot of time in the boot shop and the saddle shop, when I was growing up. And I spent a lot of summers with my brother Punch, and that's where I learned got my start in cowboying, really, And Dad would day work some on the weekends and sometimes during the week. And I was telling Ty a while ago that my first day wages, I was about 8, 9 years old. I made $2.50. We went and helped Bill Queen. He had some country north of Channing, and helped him brand calves one Saturday morning. And boy, I thought I was done, hit the big times. I had me that $2.50 check, but that would have been somewhere in the early 60s, 60, 61, somewhere along in there. And men's day wages was $10 a day. If you brought your own horse, it's $12.50 a day. And then Dad would, whenever I wasn't at Punch's camp during the summers, Dad would send me with a fellow named Bunk Pippin. And first real day working job I had, I was about 12, I guess, 13 years old, and I went with Bunk over to the XL Ranch, and they worked for J.M. Cates, and we was over there about a week, and that was my first time to really be away from home on a bona fide job, branding calves, and so I did a lot. Bunk would take me a lot with him, and Bunk was a cowboy. He came from Wagner's up to Fulton's with the Kinsavi Ranch, and he was at that Torrey Peak camp for a long time, and then he moved to Channing and lived there on the north side of town, and he took care of wheat cattle and during the winter, and day worked, and had him a pretty good day working route going, and so I had to go with him a lot, and that's kind of my cowboying history. On weekends, we'd work for Proctor's, Fulton's, and one summer I worked out at the Bivens Ranch east of Channing, just as my first ranch job, steady ranch job for the summer, and worked for Slick Moore for a while, but that's pretty much my growing, my raising. They worked at Reynolds a lot, as much as I could, and so, yeah, I didn't grow up on one. I grew up on a bunch, and that was a good thing for me. It's about a whole other world, than what it was then. One of the guys at Proctor's, Junior Hayes, that was manager at Proctor's, I always thought a lot of Junior, because if a kid wanted to work, he'd find something for him to do. He wouldn't just make a job, but if he had stuff to do and you wanted to work, he'd use you on weekends. You know, it'd be fixing fence, it'd be painting trailers or painting fence or something. He'd find something for you to do. And you know, if you ever showed the lazy bone, well, then he'd, well, appreciate your help, and then he wouldn't call you back, you know. But I enjoyed working for Junior, and I always admired the way that Jess Sorrows managed Reynolds Cattle Company at Dalhart. Jess he knew how to work men, he knew how to work cattle, he knew how to just manage it. He's a great manager. He'd give a man a camp job and give him a amount of horses. And I was with Punch the day that he went and talked to my brother, and talked to Jess about taking that job at bull camp. And I remember Jess telling him, he says, well, now we got some pickups for you guys to use. And he said, they're all on propane. But he said, we kind of like to burn oats more than we do propane. And they spent a lot of time horseback, and every morning they were horseback, and that was really formative to me. And in my later years, well, that put some stuff in me that I'd lots rather be a horseback than hanging an arm out the pickup window, you know. One of the things that I remember pretty strong that was really, it was planted in my mind pretty hard, was when I went with Bunk over to it was trailers then instead of XL. Trailers had at least, and JM was running. He had a fellow working for him named Don Doby. And it was summertime, and Don wore, if I remember right, Don wore those Pendleton wool shirts and Pendleton wool pants year round. And we were driving a bunch of cows down the fence. I don't know what, that's just all I remember, going down the fence with a bunch of cows. And there was another young kid there, and he would ride up between the cowboys and the herd. Don, he would give him the old stink eye every time he'd ride past him. Finally, he said, there's a whole lot more country on this side of me than there is between me and the cows. And that button looked at him like, okay, you know. But I picked up on what he was saying, because it had already been honed into me. You don't ride in front of people, and you stay in your place once you're dropped off there. But it, you know, that's one of the things that's carried over to now. You know, there's a lot of respect for a man's place, but it's the difference between now and then is not everybody is got the mindset that it's all about the cow. You know, sometimes we get locked into that cowboy book of etiquette, which is got to have that, and everybody knows it. But sometimes we get so locked into it, it's so methodical, and it just gets in the way sometimes. I heard a boy say one time, we can be so intent on keeping the etiquette that we get kind of obnoxious about it. And that's okay. You know, different ranches do stuff different, and so as you go in day work, I've learned to just go and watch and try to fall in place where I need to. When I was 11, 12 years old, I spent the summer with Punch down at Cogdell's. They're in the Palo Duro Canyon, Toole Canyon country, sitting there north of Silverton. We did lots of moving cattle around. A lot of that country is watered by dirt tanks, and so when dirt tank get down pretty deep and they get bogging cattle, we'd go move them to another dirt tank that had, and you know, there's a lot of hours, and that old canyon's hot, and the deer flies and cedar flies work on you pretty good, and I learned a lot about just being patient. You know, I'd want to hurry up, and then you get your tail end chewed out for trying to hurry up when you needed to let the old cows take their time. But it's that kind of stuff is really formative for me. It's one of the things that I remember about that is we'd which would freak a lot of folks out in this day and time. We'd move cattle to that dirt tank. We might get out there at daylight and get them moved over at that tank by noon, and nobody carried water canteens with us, and we'd drop them cattle and get them held up on water, and we'd ride out in that dirt tank and get us a drink of water out of that dirt tank, and that probably wouldn't go too good right now for a lot of folks, but that's what we did. And, we survived. A lot of those kind of stuff, people look at like, what? But that's what we did. Horses rode a lot more then, and they saw lots of miles. And not many outfits spend that much time on horseback anymore. These trailers are a good thing, but they sure affected our good horses, And we still ride good horses. They just don't see the miles that they used to see. And I kind of regret that. I just got through working at the Yellow House Ranch. I was down there 3 days, and they weaned and preg check cows, and once you pull up to headquarters there, well, you won't move your trailer. It's there's just one pasture that they gather where some guys will trailer around to it, but it's because it's so remote from headquarters. But everything else, you trot out in the morning and you get to the backside by daylight. And if you wind up on the backside when you're through, you trot in. And I like that. And then horses are a lot more settled, a lot more fun for me anyway. We don't hold a herd much anymore. You don't see them throw a herd together and cut the dries out like we did back then. I remember a time when, about one of the first times I went day working with Dad at Jenner's place. We were neighboring. Then Jenner's at Proctor Ranch, and we went over to the Spring Creek Ranch, and Curtis Cook was there, and we'd gathered pasture and throwed the herd up and was cutting dries out, and I was pretty green. I just barely was plucked off the vine, and we was working the herd, and I was there by my dad, and Dad told me, he says, now if it was bulls, had Hereford cattle, they get to fighting, don't get in the way. You get out of the way if one starts running, because they won't be seeing you. They're looking at that bull that's hooking them in the behind. Well, they was working the herd, and I think his name was Pee Wee King, maybe, I don't know, don't quote me on that. But that very thing happened, and Pee Wee just happened to get in the way of it, and it just happened right there in front of him. That one bull, he quit, and he whirled, and he took off running. He was looking back over his shoulder. That other one just hooking him in the butt every step, and Pee Wee turned to get out of the way, and he didn't get out of the way quick enough, and that bull picked up his horse, and I can remember that horse running on his front legs. And finally he got wound up and got out of the way, That made an impression on me. And so I didn't worry about, or Dad didn't have to worry about that on me anymore. Oh, okay, I saw that deal. Junior had mounted me that day, and he's put me on a horse called Big John, and he lived up to his name. He's probably about 16 too, and there wasn't no way I could just jump on him and go. I'd have to climb up his leg, and with laddie goes and saddle string and everything to get a stirrup. Well, the calves broke down the wire gate where we was branding, and everybody runs out there and gets on their horses, and they get around everything, and they're bringing them back. Just about the time they get back to the pens, I finally get on old Big John. I thought, well, okay, now I got to get off again, But it was, these kids, we can figure out how to get on if we just have enough time. But I don't know, Andy, ranches have changed a lot. The boys today are having to look after a lot more country than they used to have to. I know hit the JA, camps had anywhere from 15 to 20 sections per camp to look after. and or that's best I can figure, just what I know. And but now they've got where they had Plains Krill had two guys at headquarters and then some boys in the bunkhouse, and then they had one, two, three, four, had four more camps where they had 8 men on the payroll to take care of that country. Now they've got about 5 men taking care of that same amount of country, 4 to 5 men. They've got a lot of country to cover, so they do lots of trailering, and they will prowl around, but they'll trailer to a pasture, and instead of trotting out from the house, where if they just had all their camps full, they could just leave the house horseback and still get everything done. But, progress to me is not always progress. But I know the economy the way it is. These guys are finally just now getting what a cow's worth, and the rest of the economy is not keeping up with it. And so it's good for them, and it's tough for everybody else, when they go to buy beef in the store. But I'm glad to see that ranchers are finally getting paid for what they're doing, And, all of this stuff is just it's, you ask me, things that kind of formed my thinking or shaped me of what I am. All this stuff, it all works together. My first job out of high school, all I ever wanted to do is cowboy. Mom and Dad, I want to be something where I'd make a little more than what a cowboy makes, but, if you're not happy with what you're doing, it's not worth it. Cowboyed all my life except for a few stints, but my first job, I went to work for Sneed Ranch over southeast of Demas. I went to work for $200 a month, living in the bunkhouse. Camp man then there was making, I think, $250 a month. Never could figure out why a man with 3 kids just made $50 more than I did, but that was the way it was, Of course, Sneed's furnished groceries. They had a commissary at headquarters. And once a month, Wood Woodson and his wife Marie would go take a pickup and load that thing down with food for the commissary, and we'd all unload it, and they furnished beef, and some of them had milk cows, and some of them had chickens, And you pretty well had what you needed when you got there, If you wanted something extra, well, then it was up to you to get it. I worked for Scarborough Landing Cattle Company in Midland for a while I was still a single boy, and their camps were furnished with furniture. They furnished groceries, and so all they had to do is bring their clothes and personal items and move in. And one of the guys told me at one time they even furnished all the white goods, the linens and towels and sheets and all that stuff, until some of the campers got to furnishing sheets and towels for their family that didn't work there. So they cut that out. But anyway, the ranches used to furnish a lot of stuff for their men, and that's changed a lot. Some ranches now aren't even furnishing beef. And that's to me is crazy, because that's cheapest wage they can pay. And I think most of them do, but I know of some that don't. And one of the big changes that, when I was a kid, I could count on 2 things when I went to day work. Like going out to Proctor's, wherever I went, I could count on holding the cuts, and then I could count on flanking calves. There wasn't no need of me thinking about getting to drag a calf, and I didn't expect to. Junior Hayes used to tell me, he said, you got to learn how to take them off before you can put them on. And then when I got the chance to start dragging, I thought, all that taking them ropes off didn't help a bit on knowing how to put them on. But what it did do is it made me considerate of those calf flankers. I learned what wasn't very good, and I learned what I liked as a calf flanker, for the man horseback, which was different then than it is today. Those old timers, about all those old birds could just work you to death flanking calves, and they'd come out of the herd and hit strike a trot, and you'd flank that calf down, and they'd just turn around and start back to the herd. You better have that rope off, or they'd just drag you and the calf off. And if you didn't have it off, and they started dragging that calf off, well, you'd get a pretty good valve grinding over that. So you learn to jerk that rope off while you're sitting down, or how it better be off when he comes by, however it comes off. And so that was. And today, a lot of these boys will have that rope off by the time they sit down, but there's some of them will go ahead and flank it down and get the calf stretched out, and then they'll be straining, trying to get the rope off of that foot up there, and then the drag will have to wait on them. And there's two people when I was growing up that you had all the respect for. They had priority, and that was the calf dragger and the one branding, the man running the branding on it. You stayed out of their way. And it's still pretty much that way, but there's a lot. It's not as it's a lot more lax now than what it used to be, and which doesn't really affect. I guess it does affect the speed of getting the branding done, but it's still a lot of. I enjoy branding. I enjoy going and helping whatever we're doing. I just like working cattle. And when I was growing up, nobody dallied. Of course, up there around Channing, and the only ones that would dally would be team ropers eventually. Used to is all hard and fast, and they tie the knots, but on them steers. But it was, I know I was, even on a colt when dragging calves, you just tie on and just weather the storm if it happens, And by the time I was 30 years old, well, it was a pretty good mixture, People would tie on or they'd dally, they're whichever they prefer. But I noticed that in my early 20s is when you started seeing more dallying in this area, as far as on the ranches. And there's pros and cons to both. A lot of guys would dally the first calf or two on a bronc, just kind of try to stay out of a wreck. But it didn't take long. And I remember when I first started trying to dally, well, I was in my early 20s, and my dad of course, I lost Dad when I was 22, so I was probably about 19 or so whenever I started trying to, because I'd see these guys do it. That's pretty cool, and I just, but I was already pretty well set on tied on. And that was really awkward for me, and my dad said, "You're going to lose a finger doing that. You can always tell them dally boys, they got part of a finger gone somewhere," and yeah, you did, but probably in the early 70s is when it started transitioning that I know. And by the mid 70s, well, there's lots of dally boys, in this part of the country and for me, the only place I could really dally comfortably was in branding pen. I tied on too long, was just not confident enough in it, and two, if you get in a wreck and if you're dallying, you lose your rope and the cow, and if you're tied on, it may be a wreck, but you still got them, So it's pretty cool either way, and it just preference. But like I say, probably in the early 70s is when it started transitioning that I can remember. When you catching wild cattle, I don't remember anybody of any of the crews that I was on when we was cleaning up country that dallied outside, just because of that. If you ever caught them, you wanted to keep them. And the branding pen is about the most, to me, if I'm going to dally, it's going to be in a branding pen. I came up from Clarendon in, when was it, 78, and I moved up here on the XL Ranch. And we neighbored with Faines. Bob Morris was at Faines then. We was branding that first spring, and I was tied on, dragging, and I can't remember exactly what happened, but kind of had a splatterment there, and Elmer McCarty was an older feller, and he was there, and he was running the needle, and had pickup parked in the middle of the pen, and had that splatterment and that calf run around and kind of bent Elmer over the hood of that pickup. And after the wreck and dust settled, well, Bob asked me, he said, "Can you dally?" And no, not very good. So I just went on tied on. But then that's when I really started wanting to, get a little better at dallying, because I saw I could have turned that thing loose, and saved Mr. Mack a little pain. But it didn't hurt him. It just kind of mashed him up there for a minute. But it's I'm not a dally man outside. If I was on a colt or a young horse or something, it's kind of not trustworthy. Well, I just had to weather the storm. Just let her happen and then fix it after it happens. When we started seeing that Ray Hunt method and Craig Cameron was one of the first ones I saw with the natural stuff, and I thought, it's a waste of time. Just jack a leg up and saddle them and get on them and get it over with and go on, because that's what we did. We'd wool them around there, psych them out good, and get them where they're kind of used to. And I always was of the opinion, the quicker you can get on them, the better you are. Just get it over with and let's go. And, that probably caused me some problems along the way, one that had a little pitch in them. Well, then they kind of liked it because they kind of felt good. But the older I got, the more I got to looking at this other method, and kind of find out I kind of like it a little better, that learn to be a partner with a horse instead of conquering the horse, And that's pretty much what you just conquering them until they figured out what you wanted, and then they learn to be a partner with you. But the quieter you can keep a horse, I like that. I like that style because and I've always known that if a horse wants to do something, he'll be better at it, and he'll be quieter about it, and just used to, instead of trying to get one to flex and to move like it's natural to him. Well, if he went like this and they didn't turn, you just rushed up and jobbed them in the shoulder, and we didn't realize it was going against what we was wanting to do. They'd have to flex away from that spur, and then they'd have to go ahead and turn. So you had real stiff horses. But I've seen, I think the biggest impact that I can see in this method of the natural horsemanship is there's a lot more horsemen on these ranches than what there used to be. Because they just, when I was growing up, they were good men, good horsemen then. But there's more of them now, I believe, because they go through that pattern or through the system of the natural horsemanship to some degree. And they work with the horse, and they get the horse to focusing on the right thing. So I think the ranches probably as a whole, have better horses than what the strings used to be. I've heard some of the old timers say, "I am horse don't have to. All I got to do is know what a cow is, and know how to follow a cow so you can rope it." And there's some of them you couldn't turn in a half section. But if you jerk your rope down, then you couldn't pull them off the cow until you roped it. They just fall in there, and they were good at that. But you couldn't turn around in this building without hitting the wall or something, That's changed a lot, and it's changed for the good, I think. But regardless of what your method is, you still can't replace the miles. Those miles make a good horse, Dad would tell me, when I was growing up, I'd want to train on one a little bit, and Dad would tell me, he said, you just put the miles on them, And if there's anything in there between their ears, it'll come out. If you put enough miles on them, they'll figure stuff out. And you'll have a better horse because they figured it out instead of you forcing them to do it. And that's the thing about this natural horsemanship. The horse figures it out. So yeah, I think that's been an improvement in the ranching business. And plus the horses today they're not near as cold blooded as they used to be. Used to they'd want something just to go a lot of miles. So they'd want some thoroughbred blood in them. And I can remember when the quarter horses were really starting to get, this was in my early days, they'd start to breeding up these quarter horses, and then they were pretty stocky, stout made instead of that thin line running horse kind of a thing. And some of these old timers, them little short squatty things, they ain't no good. They can't last long, and come find out they did. And but that's they're breeding a lot better horse now. The cutting industry has helped that as far as cow sense goes. They've had to be careful not to breed the size out of them, and it depends on where it's at. What part of the country you're in, just if you need that old big long leggy thing. But a lot of these cutters they don't make it because they get too big, and they get something over 15 hands. Well, they're not quite as snappy as those littler ones, but still they're good horses. They make great ranch horses. The horse industry, I think, has benefited from the progress that we're seeing that's happened over the last 40 years, and that's just my opinion, but there you have it. And I think also, the thing about years ago, you still had these certain horses that just was natural at it, and then there was these horses that just learned out of repetition, and then there's these horses that learn because you just hammered it in them, and but those horses that got the natural cow, they don't. I heard a guy say one time, said, "John, see these boys spinning these horses around, and that's nice to feel. Yeah, I don't mind feeling that every once in a while." But I heard and this is a young guy, said, "I never did see a cow run circles around a horse. Why does he need to spin around like that?" Yeah, well, that makes sense, So, and I know have known some trainers that their horses didn't handle like everybody else's, but they'd beat you in the cutting pen too, So I had a horse. I worked at Maston's. It wasn't Maston Ranch, F.O. Maston Ranch on the New Mexico line on Canadian River. I was there for a while, and the horses that they had there, company horses, they were all good horses. You could run rope, and you could do whatever you needed to do on them. They were decent horses. I had a horse, we called him Big Ed. He was, my gosh, that thing as wide as this table and just as big as a tree. And you could handle him, but he wasn't one of them real snappy, quick stopping and quick turning. But when he's one of them I was talking about, once you jerked your rope down, you just mounted, and you could do whatever you needed to. And while I was there, I had some keeper heifers, and so we'd call the manager had called some neighbors in, and we were going to shape those up. We had them in a kind of a water lot there at the Blue Goose pens, and I was in there cutting out some heifers, and I was riding old Big Ed, and there's one little old heifer that I was trying to cut out some we didn't want, and she is wild just wild, and I'd tried to cut her out several times, and she'd get right there to the edge, and she just turned and run right over the top of me in a wed. And Ed, I could kind of felt like he's saying, "Let's just go rope her and quit messing with this trying to cut her out stuff." And he's getting frustrated, and I was getting frustrated, and I just got the call to preach, and everybody knew I was fixing to be a preacher. And she ran over the top of us, I don't know how many times. And I'd go cut something else out and just try to. And I was watching her, and I'd think, well, I'll catch her, and she's on the edge of the herd, and I'll just bounce her out of there before she knows it. And one time she bounced out, and she got plumb past the line of cowboys, Andy. And she looked up and saw where she was at. She turned around and run back in, right over the top of me and Ed. When she did that, I mean, I was so frustrated. And I just stopped and sat there. And Butch Boydston, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but this is the gist of what he said. I remember everybody knew I'd just been called to preach the gospel. And Butch looked at me and kind of grinned. He said, at this time, is there anything I could say for you? Everybody was waiting to see my reaction, and finally I started laughing. Oh, I guess not, Butch. Then everybody just died laughing, because they knew normally I'd have been cussing Blue Streak. But the Lord had made such a change in me that I'd lost that bad language. I think about that every once in a while, but that was pretty funny. And then, after a while, I finally got her in position and got the cuts big enough to where she could see them, and she went out then. But yeah, old Ed, he was a great rope horse, but he wasn't a great herd working horse, But she could get it done. Doesn't make you be a little more attentive and pay more attention, I had a colt when I was working. I was in the bunkhouse at the JAs, and I had a 3-year-old that was really nice colt, and had several nice colts there, and this one they called him. I can't remember what I called him. Anyway, he was a little blue horse, a little stout-made thing. We had a herd throw together. They was cutting out some pairs. I just going back and forth, and he's just doing what I had to do to help them get out of the way. So Monty Ritchie, the owner, was bringing a pair out, and for some reason, I was looking at the wrong. There's 2 or 3 pairs just walking at the same time together, and I was looking at the wrong pair. But Mr. K was this little horse's name, I think. No, that wasn't. Anyway, this little colt he got to where he was watching that cutter. And I was going to get out of the way because I was thinking of the other pair. And he wouldn't get out of the way. He was watching the right pair. He had the right one, and I didn't. It just kind of. But he was a really nice little horse. I liked him. Tony Sparks had started. He had him where he was ready to go learn something, and I just happened to be the one to ride him at that time, and he just doing what my dad said, leave him alone, they'll figure it out if you'll just make a hand, and he figured it out, and I really enjoyed him. I had another one there that was really, he was more athletic than this one, and he was one of them that could do something before you thought of it. He was already thinking about it, and it was a really nice horse. They was raising some good horses. They had some that wasn't so good, but they was raising some nice horses in. And they still are raising nice horses. Not as many, of course.
In 2011, Bunk Skelton released an album of cowboy gospel songs entitled A Cowboy at Heart. I asked Bunk to talk about how he got started playing music and when he first showed up at Western Cowpunchers.
I was probably 11, 12 years old when I started playing, thumping around there. My brother, Punch, had an old guitar, and when he left home, he left it there, and I started. Dad showed me 3 chords, old clawhammer, G and C and D, and then my mom played the piano. She had a piano bench full of old country songbooks, Eddie Arnold and Hank Williams stuff, had their chord patterns above the songs, and so I started learning some chords off of that, and then I learned to play the fiddle. I don't play it anymore. I used to for some. I found that fiddle, my dad's fiddle, under their bed one day, and drug it out and picked it up and just got playing on it, and I figured out how to play the theme song to the Jack Benny hour. So my Aunt Vera came over one day, and Mom made me get that fiddle out. And of course, Vera she'd play anything she picked up, and Mom made me get that fiddle out and play Vera your song. So I played it, and it was pretty rough, but the fiddle wasn't even in tune. So Vera said, "Let me see this thing. That thing's not even in tune." So she tuned it up, handed it back to me, and I couldn't play my song anymore. So I said, "Here, put it back." And she said, "No, you got to learn to play it with it in tune." So I played fiddle for several years and played in some bands, after I left home, and played the guitar. Just kept playing both of them along. And Rooster Morris and I used to play here. He had him a swing band, and we'd play here. But I played with just about anybody that would sit still long enough. My cousin and I, Roger Skelton, we kind of learned to play the guitar together, and we jammed a lot together. And that's pretty much the deal. And my senior year, I won the Tri-County and Dalhart Fair talent show, playing and singing, and that was a pretty good event for me. I thought that might be all right to try to do that for a living, but it didn't ever work out where I could do it for a living. I didn't pursue that. I wanted the cowboy too much, but I still played along and played a lot and as much as I could. And then I guess about the first time that I met you, I'd got about a year or two before then, I got connected with Jason Jones, and there he was working for Jack Douglas, and Jason and Wes were friends, and we got to playing together, and they introduced me to bluegrass, and I liked that bluegrass pretty good, and so we kind of got them stuff like our buddies and what have you, and they were my church band when I was pastoring there at Whiteface. We'd just take some of those old songs out of the hymn book and just grass them up, and we had a lot of fun, and people enjoyed it, But music's a great vehicle, I played guitar and fiddle in bands and we'd play in bars and stuff, which wasn't the greatest atmosphere, but I learned a lot how to take care of my equipment in those places, That was before chicken wire days, around the bandstand. And a lot of times we didn't get to take a very long break, because a fight would break out, and then the band leader said, "We got to get to playing here, guys. Get these guys busy." And so we wouldn't get to have very big breaks.
When did you first come out here to the Cowpunchers reunion? Were you coming back here back in your early days?
I didn't start coming out here till early 70s, I guess. Probably around 76, about mid-70s. I had never been here until I got playing with Rooster Morris out here. And no, I take that back. Because my sister and her husband would come over here dancing. So yeah, it's probably late 60s is the first time I'd come over. I'd come with them over here, and we'd dance around, and then after I got married, well, then we'd come all the time, just about every Saturday, and I got married in 74 the first time, and that we dated. That was our date. But I was working for Cogdell's at Silverton then, and Saturday afternoon, and she lived up west of Channing. Her folks worked for Fulton's, and I'd get off work and blast off and I'd go pick her up and stop back by my mom and dad's house in Channing, and I'd shower up and clean up and put new clean clothes on, and we'd come back down here and dance all night, you know. And then I'd take her back out there and then come back to Channing. But that was the deal. And then after we married, well, that's what we did. And then Rooster and I got to playing up here, and Rooster was already, and then he hired me to come play with him, and yeah, we played for a long time out here. I can't remember how long, but no, it was open to the public, but there's lots of cowboys here. The thing that I liked about it, even as a young, I was a terrible drinker then. But what I did admire about it, it was always a family atmosphere. You know, you'd see anywhere from there's an old gentleman here, and I can't think of his name, but he danced every dance. He was getting close to 90, and he never missed a dance. He would always every song he is up, going round and round, and there'd be anywhere from 90 years old down to 4 and 5 year olds out here on the dance floor, and this thing would be full. It was really, this was the place to go. You know, there was no alcohol inside. Of course, everybody had their, I'm going to say, of course, I know I had my cooler out there, and when the band would take a break, we'd go take a break and go to the car, but it was always a family atmosphere inside the building. And you didn't have to worry about your kids seeing some drunk fights, you know. And this is, and it was, like I said, it was open to the public as far as I knew. You know, there was some folks that didn't dress cowboy that I figured just were town folks, but yeah, it's always great. And J.M. Cates was usually making the music when I first showed up out here, and J.M. and Eddie Colley and Ivan, but they always just made good old fiddle music and didn't have much singing, if any, and but it was always good Saturday evening, you know, and you didn't have to worry about much, just enjoy, you know. You know, that's what I believe what Glenn and Ty are trying to get it going again, you know, get that old family atmosphere going here and keep that old good Western swing music going, and I think swing is going to be around as long as there's somebody to play, you know. But to find somewhere, the music has changed so much over the years to, you know, if you remember when rockabilly started coming out, well, that's when the country music started, to me, going south. And so swing is still, it's still swing. And there's no better music to me as far as that style of music, dancing music, is good old Western swing. I like to swing up some gospels, you know. We do some swing on some gospel music, and I have yet to see somebody not sit there and tap their toe to it, you know. It's just a good beat. The atmosphere of the place. As a matter of fact, you know, first time I came back after being gone so many years, I came back and I walked in here and I thought, this thing ain't near as big as I thought it was, you know. But it's been a good place. I'm glad to see them trying to keep it going.
In this next segment, I asked Bunk to talk about why he loves the cowboy life. His answer reminded me of a poem written by my old friend Darrell Arnold entitled, What a Cowboy Knows. Here's the first 4 stanzas. There's something that a cowboy knows that makes him ride the land. His choice, a life that only he and God can understand. He knows that every day he lives could be his very last, and so he must live while he can. Live hard, live good, live fast. There's something that a cowboy knows that poorer men will not, like riding circles all day in a fast ground-eating trot. He knows the wild flying charge across a rocky hill, astride 1,000 pounds of horse, the rush, the joy, the thrill. To me, there's nothing like taking
2-year-old, and riding that booger and seeing him learn and seeing him pick up things and see him develop into a horse that everybody wants. It's kind of, that's a pride thing, but it's also seeing that horse come to be everything he can be. And I've always been drawn to horses, but it's, man, that's a big old question, Andy, because there's so much about that. It's being able to outsmart a cow. I've heard so many people cuss a cow, that old stupid so and so, and I've done it myself. And finally, I realized that cow is not the stupid one. The cowboy is. He didn't outsmart her. I wrote a poem one time about a yeller cow, and the last part of it, I can't remember all of it anymore, but the last part of it says something like, now this story ain't no different than any cowboy's ride. If you've ever leaned towards the cowboy side, but cows are cows, and you got to be cow smart to outthink a cow, or all you'll see is tail. And you got to outthink them, And I learned a lot of that on that Maston Ranch. We cleaned that thing up, but being able to outsmart a cow, and then seeing a good crew work together. Carlos Ortiz was at the Spade Ranch whenever I went out there. He was on the Chapel Spade, and the Spades had leased the Clabber Hill Ranch, which joined them, and I moved on a camp on the Clabber Hill. This is in the 80s. That first spring I was there, I stayed in the bunkhouse while we were branding on the Chapel Spade, and we were gathering the country along the river, and Carlos said something at dinner, was talking about how the drive went and how it come together, and Carlos said, Bunk, man, it was really good. He said, I topped out on a hill on that river, and he said, it was a good feeling seeing everybody in place and everybody going, everything was coming together. He said, man, that was a good feeling. He said, you don't see that always, and that's true, see a good crew working together. When I was there at Whiteface, and I had it's just me and then a day man once in a while there on the ranch. But when I worked, I used the same crew all the time. They knew how I worked. They knew what I wanted, and you get to the pens, and all I had to do was just go ahead and do what you do, And our working just clicked. It was just like clockwork, and everybody enjoyed it, and everybody had a good, and we had more fun. Of course, J.B. Allen was there. He and Dub Etheridge, they kept things going for us, everybody laughing, but just that camaraderie of the cowboy life and camaraderie of being around good hands, riding good horses. I took a picture yesterday. I was sitting there on the hill waiting on the drive to come around. And that's the thing about getting older, all of a sudden you get to be a backboard instead of a cowboy, and we're just going to catch them cattle as they come around the pasture and make sure they hit the wing. But I was topped out there, and you couldn't beat the view because of the cows coming down the fence line and the cowboys all in place. And I thought, man, as far as cowboying goes, it don't get no better than this. The weather was good. It's just yeah. That's what I love. The culture of what it was is changing so much. You see things doing what we do that nobody else will ever see. While I was at the Clabber Hill, we were gathering what's called a steer pasture. And the Canadian River come in next to the Lucena Mesa, and it's kind of made a big-ass curve and then turned down towards kind of alongside 104 highway. Well, there was a dry creek come into the river with a tall, big old bluff on it, above it, and we was gathering that country, and I topped out on that bluff, and that dry creek was making kind of an S-curve like that as well. There's a cow trail cut that S curve about right in the middle, going across it. And I looked down there, and there's a little coyote carried. He'd caught him a rabbit, probably a little old mama coyote, and was going to take it back to the den for the pups. And she was going across there, and she crossed that trail and up over the hill, and another bigger coyote come loping down that creek, that dry creek bed, made the curve and come down and crossed that trail where that other had that dead rabbit. He just, brakes sat on, and he sniffed the air a minute, directly got the feeling, trailing that smell of blood. Overtook that first coyote and whipped it and took its rabbit away from it. Took off with it. So that first coyote just kind of got up off the ground, sat there a minute, like, just turned and trotted off, But people in town don't see that. And you just get to see stuff that nobody else gets to see. And, who wouldn't want to do that? That's... Nobody in the world can really imagine it till you visualize it. You can hear about it, but until you see it in live motion. I was prowling there. I was there at the Clabber Hill. I lived at San Hilario Camp, and this was first winter I was there. And there was the former leaser still had a bunch of cattle on that ranch when I first went to work there, and so Carlos Ortiz and I worked on cleaning that country up, getting all over turned out all the spayed cows, and we got a bunch of it cleaned up, and then we went ahead and turned out the spayed cows, and then I just worked around, peck around, and gather stuff, and finally we got them all, and Carlos asked me one day, he said, did you ever get that old big gray Santa Gert cow, or F1 type cow? She was up there on that La Mesa. I said, well, there's nothing on the La Mesa. Yeah, but I bet she's up there. And I remember her from last year when he was helping the previous owners, previous leasers. And I said, I don't think she's up there. So early winter, we get a little old light, real wet snow, and it was one of those real nice days after it came, and still cloudy and decent. So I just caught a horse, and I just thought, I'm just going to go. This would be a good time to see if there's anything on La Mesa, and because I knew there wasn't any spayed cattle up there. So I trotted across there and topped out, and I prowled that mesa. I didn't see any tracks, and there was an old dirt tank on that thing that the draw came down through there and went all the way to the bottom. But that dirt tank had so much rock in the dam it wouldn't hold water. But there was a lot of that old water grass, stuff that stand up like that, and kind of it was down through that draw, and I was coming up that draw towards that tank dam. And as I was trotting up that draw I was nearly to the tank dam and about to link this building from it, and had the water grass around. Well, here come a duck waddling around that tank, around that grass, and there's two coyotes chasing it. And that duck ought to thank me. I think I flushed that duck, and that duck flushed, and he flew, and this first coyote jumped to grab it, and that other coyote squatted and looked at me like this, and then I guess he said something to the other one, because they both just took off the other direction then. But, it was snow on the ground, and that old green water grass sticking up out of there like that. And I've described that to 2 or 3 artists to try to get them to paint that, because my old horse just squatted, and them ears is just like that, and oh man, only I got to see that one because I was out there, and that scene would have unfolded probably different for the duck if I hadn't been there. but anyway, you just see stuff that you won't see unless you're there. And folks in town can't imagine seeing that kind of stuff. And so that's, nothing like being out on a good horse and just enjoying what you're doing and knowing And Andy, I've had some, and I'm not complaining, but I've had lots of hard knocks in life. Teddy Roosevelt said one time, there's something about the outside of a horse that's good for the inside of a man. And he nailed it really tight. Because there's been times when nothing was working for me, and I was just, my mind was going a million miles an hour, and I'd get on a horse and I'd just start loping. And it wouldn't be long till things just start settling in my mind, And that horse time for me has been a lifesaver lots of times. I had some things happen to one of my daughters that should never have happened to her. And I had a big 140-foot round pen in my house, and the horse I had up that night, I know he hated me for it, but I just went out at 10 o'clock at night, middle of winter. I just walked out of the house, didn't put a coat on. I was so messed up in my mind. And I just went to saddle that horse and got out there and went to lope and run that round pen in the dark till finally my mind settled enough where the Lord could talk to me. And, I'm thankful for that. I appreciate God allowing me to have horses in my life, And, I went through a divorce, which I'm not proud of, but the Lord enabled me to land a really good wife, another good woman. And horses was involved in that transition, So as much as what the Lord has been, because He's used that to bring me back to some kind of sanity, where before I got saved, it would have been the bottle. And because I was a pretty knot-headed idiot when it came to the bottle, but when he saved me, well, then that turned the whole thing around, and still He uses the horses to get me to a place where He can talk to me, and to me that's invaluable, and just to be able to touch them. Teacher at a local school had asked me to come and talk about the cowboy life, and she was trying to teach her kids, familiarize her kids in her class. I think they were third graders, about the culture that was around where they were growing up. And so she asked me to come and if I would come and talk to them about being a cowboy and what all's involved, and I respectfully declined, and I was talking to my friend J.B. Allen about it later, and he just asked me, he says, well, would you rather a real cowboy, somebody knew that was a good hand, tell them about the cowboy life, or somebody tell them about a cowboy life that's just a wannabe, that don't know nothing about it? And that made me think a lot different about that kind of a thing. So, that's something that we gotta think about, and that's what I respect Andy doing this, to at least get this stuff archived up. My dad he was a cowboy from way back, and there's a story about him. He was born in 1917. He was born in San Saba County, and my granddad was a horse and mule trader. My uncle was telling me this story after Dad had passed away. He passed away in 1974, but my uncle, his brother, who was 2 years older than him, was telling me this a few years later, that when they moved from San Saba County, they landed in Lamb County by Littlefield, Texas, and he said any of the kids that was big enough to ride, well, they drove. He said Granddad had about 40 head of mules and horses that he's trading with, and he said anybody big enough to ride in the family, they rode and drove them mules. Granddad and grandmother would take the smaller ones, which would have been my Aunt Vera. Well, I don't think she was born yet. I think my Uncle Tuffy was one of the smaller ones, and was the smaller one. But Dad was 5 years old when they left San Saba County, so he drove the horses with the rest of the boys. And Red said that they got, he didn't know what town it was, but used to, all these little towns had milk cow traps for the townspeople, and it was just a common trap. And that, of course, with milk cow, she'll go back to where her calf is, and so the deal was they'd put them out there at night or during the day rather, and then they'd be ready to go back to their calf in the evenings. They'd keep them up overnight, and then they'd go back to graze the next day, and it wasn't a big deal. So they'd turn them horses out in those milk cow traps overnight. They'd stake a couple out so they could gather them horses in the morning. And he said it just happened to be that he and my dad's horses were staked out. And they hadn't been gone from San Saba County very long, maybe a day or two. And he said they went out there to catch their horses to go gather them, and the gate was down and the horses were gone. And Red said that Granddad told him, said, "You boys go get them horses." Dad was 5, Red was 7. And they caught their horses, and they went to tracking them horses. And he was talking about, he didn't know how far they'd gone, but there's 2 kids, and they was getting cold, and they was getting tired and thirsty and hungry. And they was trotting down a lane into another town there, and he said they looked down and they saw he told me a dime, and then Punch remembered the story as being a quarter, but either way, they found a coin laying in the road, going to town, and so they harvested that coin, went to the mercantile, and he said the first thing they bought was a bag of bull durham. They was both thirsty and hungry, but they bought that bag of bull durham first. And then they got cheese and crackers, and then went to the milk cow trap in that town to drink before they'd have water. But they harvested the horses. They brought them back. And I could think about when I was 5 or 7 years old, and don't send me after a bunch of horses. I might not get back. But they grew up different. When they landed in Littlefield, down there at Littlefield, Texas, and then they stayed in the Panhandle after that. Dad worked for the Matador Land and Cattle there on the Canadian River. When he left home, he wound up in Magdalena, New Mexico. He worked all over, as a young cowboy, and then he came back, was working for Reynolds Cattle Company when he married my mother. Oh, anyway, he was this time he had a camp there at Reynolds Cattle Company, and I had left Sneed's, my first ranch job. I'd quit and came home and they were weaning calves at the Reynolds, and my brother Punch was at Walker Camp, and Dad was at Bull Camp. They both worked for Reynolds. So Dad loaned me a horse, and I helped him the next day, and then I talked to Jess Sarles about helping him through the fall works, and Jess hired me. But we gathered a big old pasture at Pundiawa Pastures, about 14 sections, and the 3 of us, we came in on the southwest corner, and then the headquarters crew come in on the northeast corner, and they just swung around, and we met kind of in the middle, and Dad told Punch to go around the outside up the northwest and on the north side of it, and I just filled in between him and my dad. Dad met the bunch coming around headquarters. We made a good drive. We gathered tons of cattle. That evening, we were going back to the house. Dad's real quiet, and you could tell he was thinking. And since he was quiet, well, me and Punch are quiet. That's kind of the deal. And so anyway, finally Dad says, all I ever wanted for you boys was to be top hands. And he said, I saw that today. I thought, man, it made my old chest pooch out, Of course, I was a long ways from a top hand, but it sure made me feel good to hear him say that. And Punch was he was the kind of guy that would take a horse that somebody else had turned in because it's too rank or didn't like, or most of the time it's because they'd pitch. And he would take a horse that nobody else liked or wanted, and he'd just ride him and make a good horse out of him. The way he handled a horse, a bucking horse wouldn't always buck with him. And if something ever started gathering up to pitch, well, he'd just whip them out of it before they ever got started, And somebody asked him, or told him one day, he said, I don't know how I ain't got guts enough to do that. And he said, well, I ain't got guts enough not to. I can't ride good enough to try to ride them when they pitch. I got to beat them to the draw. But he made a lot of good horses. He never left a place that he didn't leave some good horses behind him. And that inspired me to want to leave good horses behind me. I was never I didn't have the nerve that he had or that my dad had with the bucking horses, but I always could kind of ride one and make it through. But those were some big shoes to follow. So I tried to focus on being just a good hand at everything else and try to fill in the gap. But yeah, I had some pretty big shoes to follow, both men right there. And I guess when I get to heaven, I'll find out how I did, But
Quite a legacy.
it is. It really is. And I felt the pressure, A lot of boys they get tired of hearing, well, that's Fat Skelton's boy or that's Punch Skelton's brother. For a while, I didn't like that until I got old enough to realize there's nothing wrong with being Fat's boy or Punch's brother. And I started enjoying being connected to them. And that put pressure on me, too, to be a good hand because they were good hands. So, yeah, that's kind of their deal. And, they wherever you go, Dad asked me when I graduated from high school, he said, what do you want to do in life? I'm going to be a good hand, be the best cowboy I can be. Well, what does it take to be a top hand? And I was, well, you got to be able to ride a bronc, rope a cow, and know cattle, and you got to be able to know horses, and you just got to know how to make a drive and be a good hand in the pens and whatever's going on. He said, well, yeah, that's part of it, but he said, what does it take to be a top hand? Well, I already answered that, and he said, no, if you want to be a top hand, he said, you can work on this outfit, and you can help them do what they want to get done to the best of your ability, however they want to do it without griping. And then you can go across the fence where they do something totally different, and you can do the same. You help them do what they want to get done, how they want to do it without griping. That's a top hand. It doesn't matter whether it's the way you like it or not, but you help them do what they want to do, however they want to do it. Now, that ain't no top hand, but come to find out, that's a top hand. I've seen guys that made their living day working, and they go all over the country, and they never complain about anything. They just, well, I never seen it done this way, but okay, here we go. I'm going to see it done. And after I started trying to be that, I started enjoying cowboying a lot more. Not everything always suited me, but I started enjoying it a lot more because I was pretty critical for a long time. It's either my way or that ain't the right way. Punch said one day, he said, well, that's the way we learned. That's how we know to do it. They learned a different way. And my dad told me one time, I always wanted to work in the mountains. And I finally got a chance to. And I come home and I said, Dad, those are about the most no cowboying bunch I ever saw. They don't, and really, they just didn't do it the way I was taught, and they didn't over and under everywhere they went. And I really wasn't taught that. I just thought that was being wild, And they just really laid back, and everything worked okay. And Dad told me, he says, I want to tell you something. He said, there's some cowboys up there. Wherever there's a cow, there's going to be a cowboy somewhere. And he may not do it the way you like, but there's a cowboy there. And he's right. There's always a cowman and a cowboy somewhere where there's cows.
folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Bunk Skelton for taking the time to visit with me. I'd like to thank my friends at the Western Cowpunchers Association and Reunion for helping me to arrange this interview. You can find out more about the Western Cowpunchers Association at westerncowpunchers.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, Scott Anderson, Paige Marie Polis, Gabe Rosen, and Helen DeZio. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.